The Government of India Act 1919, Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, the illusion of responsible government, and the genesis of diarchy. The Government of India Act 1919 stands as one of the most significant and analytically rich constitutional experiments in the history of British India. Emerging from the political ferment of the First World War and the subsequent promise of reform, the Act represented the British Empire's most ambitious attempt to introduce the principle of responsible government to India. However, from a political science perspective, it was a deeply flawed and ultimately unworkable system designed to give the illusion of power without the substance. Its core mechanism, diarchy, became a byword for a complex and schizophrenic form of government that satisfied no one and radicalized the Indian political landscape, pushing the national movement towards non-cooperation. First, the genesis from wartime promise to post-war settlement. The act was the product of a specific historical movement shaped by wartime compacts, rising nationalist demands, and a British desire to manage rather than fulfill Indian aspirations. The Montagu Declaration 1917, a constitutional point of no return. The most immediate catalyst was the August 1917 announcement by the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, which declared the British government's new policy. The gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of a responsible government in India as an integral part of the British Empire. Political significance. This was a revolutionary statement. For the first time, the British Parliament had explicitly committed itself to the goal of responsible government for India. It created an irreversible benchmark against which all subsequent reform would be measured. This declaration was itself a response to intense nationalist pressure, notably from the Home Rule movement led by Tilak and Annie Besant. The Montagu-Chelmsford Report, 1918. Edwin Montagu and Viceroy Lord Chelmsford toured India to formulate specific proposals. Their report became the basis for the Government of India Act 1919. The report acknowledged the growing demand for self-rule but advocated a cautious, gradual approach, fearing that a shift transfer of power would lead to chaos. This philosophy of cautious gradualism was embedded in the Act's final structure. Source integration. The context and implications of Montagu Declaration are analyzed in P.D. Reeves' essay in Congress of the Raj, Facets of India's Struggle, 1917 to 47. The political pressure from the Home Rule movement is detailed in Bipin Chandra's India's Struggle for Independence. The core constitutional mechanism, diarchy in provinces. The most innovative and controversial feature of the Act was the introduction of diarchy, dual role, in the provincial governments. The theory, a training school for self-government. The premise was to divide the provincial subjects of administration into two separate lists. Reserved subjects, these were the most critical departments: law and order, finance, land revenue, and irrigation. These remained under the sole control of the governor and his executive councillors, who were British officials not responsible to the legislature. Transferred subjects, these were considered less vital departments: education, public health, local self-government, agriculture, public work. These were transferred to Indian ministers chosen from the elected members of the provincial legislative council. These ministers were responsible to the legislature and could be voted out by it. The governor acted as the linchpin, with overriding authority over both halves of the government, holding the power to certify legislation rejected by the legislature. The practice and fatal flaws. The political science autopsy diarchy was a theoretical construct that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions in practice. Artificial and unworkable division of subjects. The division was logically flawed. For instance, local self government transferred was impossible to administer without control over finance reserved. Similarly, agricultural transfer was hamstrung without control over irrigation reserved. This created constant friction and deadlock between the two halves of the government. Financial strangulation. The provincial budget was split, but the reserved side controlled all major sources of revenue. The transferred subjects, the Indian ministers, had to run their departments on a fixed grant from the reserved treasury, which was almost always insufficient. This financial starvation made it impossible for the ministers to implement any meaningful policies, ensuring their failure and discrediting the very idea of Indian self rule. Lack of real power and governor's veto. The governor's overriding power to certify bills, overrule ministers, and administer the reserved subject as he saw fit rendered the principle of ministerial responsibility a farce. Nationalists lightly dubbed it a system of power without responsibility and responsibility without power. Source integration, the theory and failure of diarchy, and critically examined in R.J. Moore's The Crisis of Indian Unity 1970 to 1940. The practical administrative nightmare is vividly described in the contemporary writings of Indian leaders, such as those found in the collected works of C.Y. Chintamani and M.R. Jayakar. Other key provisions of the Act. Beyond diarchy, the Act introduced several other significant changes to the central government and the electoral system. A central government, a mockery of responsibility. The Act introduced a bicameral legislature at the center for the first time, a legislative assembly, lower house, and the Council of State, upper house. However, the principle of responsible government was explicitly rejected at the center. The Viceroy and his executive council remained completely unaccountable to the legislature. The legislature had virtually no control over the Viceroy's government, which held vast certifications powers to pass any law deemed essential. Expansion of franchise and communal electorates. The franchise right to vote was expanded, but it remained extremely limited based on property tax and educational qualification. Only about 1 to 3% of the population gained the vote. The act further solidified the communal representation established by the 1909 Act. Separate electorates were not only retained for Muslim but were now extended to Sikhs, Indian Christians, the Anglo-Indians, further fragmenting the political arena along religious lines. The Rowlatt Act connection. It is crucial to note that while discussing reforms, the British government also passed the repressive Rowlatt Act 1919, which extended wartime emergency measures, allowing for detention without trial. This stark contradiction between the promise of reform and the reality of expression exposed the true intent of the British for many Indians and had led directly to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the launch of the non-cooperation movement. The nationalist response and the impact on the freedom struggle. The Indian reaction to the act was overwhelmingly negative and marked a definitive radicalization of the nationalist movement. The Congress position inadequate, unsatisfactory, and disappointing. After initial debate, the Congress condemned the reforms at its 1920 Nagpur session. The moderates who were willing to work the reforms left the Congress, leading to a decisive victory for the more radical faction. The reforms were a key reason for the launch of the non-cooperation movement 1920 to 22 under Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi argued that the reforms were not merely inadequate but designed to strengthen British control. The call for a boycott of the council was a central plank of the movement. The rise of council entry versus non-cooperation. A section of leaders, notably C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, formed the Swaraj Party in 1923. They argued for the ending ending the reforms from within by contesting election, entering the councils, and obstructing their functioning to expose their hollowness. This created a strategic tension within the Congress between the pro-changers, Swarajists, and no-changers, Gandhians. Long-term impact and legacy. A demonstrated failure. The unworkability of diarchy proved to Indian nationalists that the British were not serious about transferring real power. It discredited the path of constitutional coercion for a generation. A constitutional precedent, despite its failure. The Act established important structural precedents: a bicameral legislature, a partial transfer of power to elected representatives, and a clearer division of subjects between the center and provinces, all of which influenced the Government of India Act 1935 and ultimately the Indian Constitution. Deepening communal divides. The extension of separate electorates further hardened communal identities and made a unified nationalist constitutional settlement increasingly difficult. Source integration. The nationalist debate over the reforms is brilliantly captured in B.R. Nanda's The Nehrus, Motilal, and Jawaharlal. The strategic shift toward non-cooperation is the central theme of Judith M. Brown's Gandhi's Rise to Power, Indian Politics 1915 to 22. Conclusion: a crucible of discontent. In final analysis, the Government of India Act of 1990 was a pivotal failure in the constitutional history of British India. While presented as a progressive step towards self-government, its underlying structure was designed to maintain ultimate British control. The experiment of diarchy, its core innovation, was a cynical and unworkable system that provided a political education not in responsible government, but in the mechanics of colonial obstruction. By failing to meet the expectation raised by the Montagu Declaration and by coupling reform with repression, the Rowlatt Act, the act disillusioned even moderate Indian politicians. It did not pacify the demand for Swaraj, it amplified it, convincing a generation of Indians that freedom would not be won through cooperation with the disingenuous, disingenuous imperial power, but only through mass, non-violent, non-cooperation. The Act of 1919 therefore stands not as a milestone on the road to freedom, but as the crucible in which the final mass-based phase of the Indian freedom struggle was forged.